drugs or would denounce that group upon taking power, if that was ever to come to pass. But they certainly have co-opted them in their struggle to overthrow the elected government in Peru. Is that analogous, do you believe, to what the CIA was up to in Southeast Asia?
Sure. There have been other rebel groups that have protected and involved in the drug trade. In the uplands of the Andes or in the Asian Opium Zone, which runs across 4,500 miles of insurgency-filled mountains from Turkey across to Laos, all the groups involved that bid for power ultimately wind up dealing with the drug trade because it's the main source of income. So when you get in that zone, unless you have a particular restriction, unless you really work hard to avoid it, you will in fact find your operations becoming intermingled with the opium trade. Mm-hmm. For example, in northern Burma during the 1980s, one of the major players emerged was the Burmese Communist Party. They took control over the prime opium zone because they were backed by the People's Republic of China, supplying them with arms and bases inside China. That party, of course, collapsed about 2 years ago, and the traffic has now reverted to the drug warlords. But, yeah, other groups have done it.
Mm-hmm. Is that also analogous to, or do you think that also describes, in effect, our relationship with Manuel Noriega? That we basically knew how he made his money, but for the time being, he was useful to us.
Exactly, and that's a whole pattern of alliance that U.S. intelligence engaged in throughout the Cold War. We looked the other way on drugs.
All right, let's get some listeners involved here. Dick from Evanston, you're on WLS.
Yes, I wanted to say that I read Professor McCoy's book, the first book, about 15 years ago, and I'm certainly satisfied with the scholarship. I'm glad he's exposed the CIA hypocrisy. On the other hand, it's just common sense that the CIA would work with smugglers, people who are forced to work illegally. So I think the issue, to some extent, is getting rid of smugglers. And I would posit this, that if there's three drugs that are smuggled that I think should be legalized. One would be marijuana, second one would be coca leaf, and the third would be opium. I'm not speaking now necessarily of heroin, but raw opium for eating and smoking purposes. I would suspect, and as a matter of fact, I've heard Professor McCoy before on a radio program in Wisconsin where he spoke of when he was doing his research in Southeast Asia. He smoked about, he talked about getting smashed on wine, local wine produced there. So I know he's, or at least at one time, was a consumer of alcohol. If we can say alcohol is okay to consume in this country, that's a cultural thing that we accept, why should we be repressing the trade in opium in Asia, something that's been used there by those indigenous cultures for thousands of years? Similarly, the coca leaf in South America and worldwide now, marijuana. So why not move to legalization?
Yeah, I understand your question. What do you think?
Okay, first of all, there's 2 points. The first point about whether the CIA was simply allying with smugglers, and we've got to expect this. Yeah, sure, the drug trade is a vast subterranean enterprise. It's not just a petty vice, it's a global commodity trade. And the people that control it, both in the uplands, the producers, and in the lowlands, the financiers and the processors, as well as the organized crime groups in the first world that dominate distribution. This constitutes, in fact, an instant apparatus for covert operations. There are only 2 groups in the world that have a kind of capacity in the clandestine arts. One are intelligence agency, and the 2 are organized criminals, syndicate groups. So there's a natural alliance, a natural sympathy of tactic and technique. Now, there's another very large question. Should a state ally itself with those groups? And I think the alliances are not exactly benign. We're simply not allying with an existing force. When we extend the protection of the United States, particularly its most CIA, to these groups, in fact, we're increasing their power. So it's not benign into something that's existing. In fact, we make the problem worse. Okay, now the second issue, legalization. I have a lot of doubts about legalization. First of all, we can't simply undo the present. We can't run the camera backward and get back to the way the situation was before we prohibited drugs. The fact is that the drug situation as it exists now is the problem. You have to deal with it. So we can't go backward. The past is not a guide here. Now, I don't think legalization is a political reality in the United States. I don't think it's going to happen. I can't imagine the congressman, the state legislator that's going to stand up and legalize drugs. First of all, there's a real problem, okay? This is a country, very puritanical country, that just went through the process of raising the age of legal age for consumption of alcohol to 21. It's now mandatory all across the United States. A lot of states had 18-year drinking age. It's now 21 across the country. Let's look at the drug problem. All right, leaving aside marijuana, let's look at hard drugs. The largest hard drug in the United States is crack cocaine, by far the biggest. Most consumers, depending on the survey you look at, and they're imprecise, it changes day to day, and it's partly impressionistic, most surveys indicate that about 80 to 90% of crack cocaine users are under the age of 21. Now, if we legalize this drug, we're going to be legalizing it for the 10% of people who are adults. The 90% of those who are illegal users are going to wind up still being denied access to the drug, unless this country stands up and says, right, we're going to legalize drugs for kids, and we're going to have crack cocaine sold legally in shops near schools. I think that's political dynamite. I don't think it's even going to happen. Think of the racial politics of that. The majority of crack cocaine users today are poor, and they're in the cities, they're black and Hispanic. I can't imagine that state legislatures, the U.S. Congress, is going to even contemplate such legislation. So legalization, in fact, or legalization for adults, would create a situation where 10% of the population who are, let's say, using the drug legally could support the habit by buying from legal outlets and selling illegally.
Why do you make the exception with marijuana?
Marijuana, that's a very different issue.
Why?
First of all, I don't know much about it. I'm a heroin specialist.
All right. Thanks.
It's a very different kind of drug. First of all, marijuana is grown domestically in large quantities, all right? It's a natural drug that's grown domestically as well as is grown abroad, so that the traffic dynamics are very different. Second of all, there is a lot more debate about the desirability of making marijuana available. There are a lot of people that advocate that if alcohol should be legal, marijuana should be, all right? Now, there isn't that kind of debate. There is nobody that will stand up and say, I like crack. Crack's a great drug, and I feel really great when I'm on crack. Or there's nobody standing up that says, I really like smack. You know, heroin's wonderful. Everybody should have it. There are people that make that argument for both alcohol and for marijuana.
That's true. Hang on. We will take a quick break, very quick break, right? Right back to the calls and our guest right after this.
Remodeling a kitchen is usually an expensive Chicago at 591-8900 on WLS Talk Radio 890. Now, more of Stacy Taylor.
And Alfred W. McCoy and Frank on a payphone. You're on WLS. Hello.
Yeah, good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
I'd like to make a quick comment and then ask Mr. McCoy a question. 70% of the world's cocaine, about 85% of America's cocaine, comes out of Peru, one place. And right now that country is going through a massive cholera epidemic, first one in about 50 years, and they're at war with a bunch of people called Sendero Luminoso, and every single bit of this is somehow connected to either Max Mermelstein, Mike Harari, Erica Feek, Yair Klein. Why is it every one of you experts that get on the radio and write a book or do whatever you do, you never mention this Israeli connection in this cocaine, the protection? Everybody always, they don't know nothing. Can you answer this? Maybe you can tell me something about it.
Okay, first of all, my book is on heroin, all right? It's not, I deal with the cocaine issue in terms of CIA complicity. There is a book that's come out from University of California Press by Peter Dale Scott and Jonathan Marshall called Cocaine Politics. It does deal in part with this Israeli connection. I'm not an expert on that. That's a different continent, different drug.
I think he was hoping that you would just deny it so that we could spend the rest of the time talking about that. So no denial there, Frank. Thanks for the call. Dion from North Side, you're on WLS.
Hello, how you doing?
Doing well, sir.
Hey, Mr. McCoy, how are you? I have a question for you. During the Iran-Contra affair, I remember some protesters who came inside of the house where they were in, and were protesting about drugs as something that was being shipped to the United States and sold, and also to aid the Contras in their the purchase of machine guns and that kind of thing. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, in my book I deal with this because it's another instance of CIA complicity, and I drew largely upon the hearings conducted by Senator Kerry. In 1987-88, Senator Kerry conducted formal hearings in his Committee on Terrorism in the U.S. Senate, and he investigated what's known as guns down, drugs up. That is to say that airlines that were contracted by the U.S. State Department and perhaps by the CIA to supply equipment to the Contras all ordered that equipment in landing strips in Costa Rica in particular, and unloaded cocaine which was shipped into the United States. Senator Kerry took testimony from pilots who claimed that they sat there and saw cocaine loaded on their aircraft, and they flew that aircraft into the United States.
Now see, when I see these particular things happen, and I begin to question, everyone seems to want to put the lid on this particular issue when it comes to the Reagan administration, when it comes to the Bush administration. I believe that they are some of the highest ranking officials are responsible for this particular drug trade, the kids in the city. I remember earlier you said, Stacy, I think it is, you said that, do you even care about what's going on with this? And it's like, yeah, because right down the street, here's the dope right here in our street. They put it in the cities where they're the most blacks, most Hispanics. They know there's money to be made off of it, and they know that it's going to deteriorate the growth of these particular people. And, Well,
the reason I asked the question whether anybody cared, obviously the question was not directed at you. It was directed at people who honestly would say that the threat of international communism is greater than the threat of drugs in the inner city. There are people who would agree to that.
Let's say this. Your top-ranking officials here in the United States allowing money to be laundered through that bank overseas, along with all of the other people who they're sending our young boys over to fight against. I mean, they're collaborating with these people. They collaborated with Noriega. They knew he was running drugs in and out of this country. They just went down there and got him to shut him up because he knew too much. I feel as though that if my homeboy on the end of the corner down here can get 45 years to life for dealing 2 keys of cocaine, the FBI and all of these other enforcement agencies should actually seek out and get the real people who are responsible for the drugs being in this country.
But you're asking some good. You're alluding to some good questions, and let me ask them now, Dion, if you don't mind. I'll take a break in a second here, or you can be thinking about this during the break, Professor McCoy. I'd like to know what the connection is then, I mean, in an intra-agency or interagency context, if the CIA is, quote, complicitous in the trafficking of heroin, let's say. I'm curious as to what kind of follow-through there is between that agency, which is a part of the executive branch of government, and let's say the FBI, which is also in the executive branch, or the DEA. Is there any connection? I mean, do they trace these shipments?
No, I want to go back to the substance of that caller's allegation as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So hang on a second, mull that one over, and we'll come back and get an answer and move on to some other calls on WLS right after this.